On September 22, 1985, inside a quiet hotel in New York City, 5 finance ministers gathered around a table no larger than a family dinner setting. There were no protests outside, no emergency broadcasts, no sense that history was about to tilt. A short document was signed. It was called the Plaza Accord. Within hours, nothing seemed to change. Within months, everything had. The Japanese yen began to rise, relentlessly, eventually doubling in value against the US dollar in less than 2 years. And years later, when Japan's asset bubble burst and the country slid into what would be called the lost decade, then quietly, the lost 20 years, the story was usually told differently. Analysts blamed reckless banks, speculative real estate, a rigid society, an aging population. All true. But incomplete, because the chain reaction did not begin on the trading floors of Tokyo, nor in the suburbs packed with overvalued homes. It began here, in that room, on that day. This was not an invasion, not a sanction, not a collapse triggered by war or disaster. It was a recalibration, cold, technical, almost polite. A decision that adjusted prices rather than borders, incentives rather than laws. And yet, it would bend the trajectory of an entire nation. Japan did not fall in a single moment. It was nudged onto a different path and told it was stability. The real mystery is not why Japan struggled afterward. It is why this moment is so often treated as background noise. Who needed this lever pulled? What fear demanded it? And how did a single agreement turn a miracle economy into a system that could no longer escape its own momentum? To understand why the lever was pulled, the camera has to move backward to the early 1980s, when the American economy was growing, but bleeding at the seams. On paper, the United States was still the center of the industrial world. In reality, its factories were closing one after another. Steel towns hollowed out, auto plants went dark. On store shelves, made in Japan was no longer a novelty, it was the default. Cars, televisions, semiconductors, reliable, cheaper, and increasingly superior. By 1984, the U.S. trade deficit with Japan alone had surged past $30 billion, a number that stopped being abstract when translated into layoffs, union pressure, and angry voters. Politicians felt it in town halls. Executives felt it in quarterly reports. And Washington felt it in elections. The problem, as American policymakers saw it, was not effort or innovation. It was arithmetic. The dollar was too strong. A strong dollar made imports cheap and exports expensive. Every Japanese car rolling off a ship in California carried an invisible subsidy written in exchange rates. Every American machine tool shipped overseas arrived with a built-in penalty. Tariffs were discussed, but they were blunt weapons. Trade wars promised retaliation. And there was another fear, quieter but deeper. Protectionism could fracture the very alliance system the U.S. had built after World War II. Japan was not an enemy. It was a pillar, a frontline state in the Cold War. You could not punish it openly without risking the architecture of American power in Asia. So the pressure had to move sideways, away from factories and toward finance, away from Congress and into central banks. The goal was simple to state and hard to execute. Make Japanese exports more expensive without passing a single law. Let markets do the dirty work. If the yen rose and the dollar fell, the trade imbalance would shrink without anyone having to admit coercion. This was not about hurting Japan, at least not officially. It was about relief, about buying time, about saving an American industrial base the voters could still recognize with their hands. And yet, implicit in this strategy was an assumption, one rarely spoken aloud, that Japan could absorb the shock, that it would adjust smoothly, that a country built on discipline and coordination would bend, not break. The question hanging in the air was never whether the lever would work. It was whether anyone truly understood what would happen once it was pulled. Across the Pacific, Japan in the early 1980s looked almost untouchable. Its economy had done what many thought impossible: rise from the ashes of war, to become an export superpower in a single generation. Growth was steady, unemployment was low, and the social contract still held. Companies promised lifetime employment. Workers gave loyalty in return. At the center of this system sat a quiet assumption that rarely needed to be spoken. The yen would remain weak, and the world, especially the United States, would keep buying. This was not recklessness. It was structure. Japan imported raw materials, added precision and discipline, and shipped finished goods outward. The margin lived in scale. The fuel was foreign demand. By 1985, nearly one-third of Japan's exports were headed for the American market. That dependency was not seen as a vulnerability. It was seen as proof of success. Japanese executives did not wake up fearing the U.S. consumer. They studied him, designed for him, optimized around him. In Tokyo, the worry was not collapse, but friction. Trade tensions were growing louder. American politicians spoke of unfairness. Editorials accused Japan of gaming the system. But inside Japan's ministries, there was confidence that this was noise, not danger. Japan was a responsible ally. It bought U.S. Treasury bonds. It hosted American troops. It followed the rules of the post-war order, rules largely written by Washington itself. That confidence shaped the decision-making. When the United States asked for cooperation, it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like coordination, a request among partners to stabilize a system that seemed, on the surface, to be working too well. Japanese policymakers believed they could manage an appreciating currency. They had done hard things before. They trusted their institutions, especially their central bank, to smooth the transition. And there was another, more human factor at play. Saying no carried its own risk. Refusing the world's largest economy, the security guarantor, the anchor of global finance, would have marked Japan as defiant, even selfish. That was not how post-war Japan survived. So when Japan entered the room, it did not enter as a victim. It entered as a confident participant, a nation convinced it understood the machine it was part of. What it underestimated was not the lever itself, but the speed and force with which it would move. And more critically, how little room there would be to step aside once it did. The mechanism itself was deceptively simple. No new institution, no secret clause, just coordination. The Plaza Accord committed the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom to a shared action. Weaken the dollar by intervening in currency markets. In practice, that meant central banks selling dollars and buying other currencies, especially the yen. Exchange rates, usually treated as the product of countless invisible decisions, were suddenly nudged, firmly, by the hands that mattered most. This was the lever. Currency intervention, stripped of jargon, is price setting at scale. When enough power sells one thing and buys another, markets follow. And they did. The yen began to climb almost immediately. From around 240 yen to the dollar in early 1985, it surged past 200, then 150, then near 120 within 2 years. For American policymakers, this was success. Japanese exports became more expensive overnight, without a single tariff vote. The adjustment looked clean, elegant even. But inside Japan, the shift was violent. Exporters operate on thin margins. Contracts are signed months, sometimes years, in advance. A rapidly rising currency does not just reduce profits, it erases them. A car sold in the U.S. for the same sticker price suddenly returned far fewer yen when the money came home. What had been a strength, efficiency, turned into exposure. Japan's leaders faced a choice that felt unavoidable: Let exporters fail and unemployment rise, or counteract the shock. They chose counteraction. The Bank of Japan lowered interest rates again and again to cushion the blow. Cheap money was meant to offset the expensive yen. If exports could not grow through price, they would survive through credit. This was the second link in the chain. Lower rates made borrowing easy. For companies, for banks, for households. Money flowed, searching for return, but it did not flow back into exports fast enough. It pooled elsewhere. Here is where the trap begins to close. Currency appreciation pushed Japan to stimulate. Stimulation inflated asset prices, and rising asset prices created the illusion that the system was not just stable, but thriving. Land in Tokyo became worth more than land anywhere on Earth. The stock market soared. On paper, Japan was richer than ever. The lever had worked exactly as designed, just not in the place anyone was watching. And once the system adjusted to this new equilibrium, reversing course became far harder than pulling the lever had ever been. By the late 1980s, Japan was awash in money, and the country mistook liquidity for health. Interest rates, pushed down to protect exporters, stayed low long enough to change behavior. Banks no longer saw risk the way they once had. Lending was no longer an exception. It was the engine. Corporations borrowed not just to invest, but to speculate. Households followed. Real estate became collateral, then identity. Land was not just land. It was a balance sheet. In central Tokyo, commercial plots were valued so highly that analysts joked the imperial palace was worth more than all the real estate in California. It sounded absurd. It was also almost true. The stock market reflected the same logic. The Nikkei index climbed past 30,000, then 38,000 by the end of 1989. Shares were no longer priced on future cash flow, but on faith that prices would keep rising. This was not madness in the cinematic sense. It was rationality distorted by incentives. When money is cheap and assets only go up, caution looks like incompetence. Bankers who refused to lend lost clients. Executives who stayed conservative lost market share. The system rewarded momentum, not restraint. Japanese policymakers watched this with unease, but also with pride. On the surface, the Plaza shock had been absorbed. Unemployment remained low. Growth continued. Internationally, Japan looked unstoppable, buying iconic properties abroad, exporting capital as confidently as it once exported cars. The earlier fear, that a strong yen would cripple the economy, seemed misplaced. Instead, Japan appeared to have discovered something better: prosperity without pain. But this stability was conditional. It depended on asset prices staying high enough to justify the debt built on top of them. It depended on banks rolling over loans rather than questioning them. And crucially, it depended on the Bank of Japan continuing to prioritize growth over correction. The lever that had been pulled in New York had forced Japan to choose stimulation over adjustment. Now that choice had hardened into habit. The danger was not hidden. It was normalized. Every year that passed made reversal more costly. To raise rates risked popping the bubble. To slow credit risked exposing balance sheets built on optimism. Japan was no longer reacting to an external shock. It was defending an internal structure of its own making. The question was no longer whether this was sustainable. It was how long the system could pretend that it was. By the time anyone was willing to say the word bubble out loud, the bubble had already become the economy. Asset prices were no longer a side effect of growth. They were the growth. Companies measured success not by productivity, but by the appreciation of land they owned. Banks judged solvency not by income, but by collateral that revalued itself upward every year. Even households began to think of homes less as places to live and more as leveraged assets. This was the quiet transformation. An industrial economy slowly turning into a balance sheet economy. The numbers told the story if you knew where to look. Land prices in major Japanese cities tripled in less than a decade. The total value of Japanese real estate on paper surpassed that of the United States, a country more than 20 times larger by area. Credit expanded faster than wages. Profits increasingly came from financial maneuvering rather than manufacturing efficiency. None of this felt dangerous in real time. It felt sophisticated. Japan was not speculating, many believed. It was optimizing capital. And there was a psychological shift that mattered as much as any policy. Risk became invisible. When losses are delayed and gains are immediate, behavior changes. Banks rolled over bad loans instead of recognizing them. Companies borrowed to buy assets, then used rising asset values to justify more borrowing. The loop reinforced itself. This was not greed in the caricatured sense. It was conformity. To step out of the cycle was to fall behind. Everyone understood that prices were high. Fewer believed they could ever truly fall. What made the system especially fragile was its timing. Japan's population was beginning to age. Domestic demand was not accelerating. The export engine, already weakened by the strong yen, could not carry the load alone. Asset inflation filled the gap, masking structural slowdown with paper wealth. The Plaza Accord no longer needed to be mentioned. Its effects had been internalized, embedded into decision-making, absorbed into expectations. By the end of the decade, Japan looked powerful beyond precedent. Its companies dominated global rankings. Its banks were the largest in the world. Its capital reshaped skylines from New York to London. Yet beneath the surface, growth had become dependent on an assumption that could not be tested without breaking everything, that asset prices would never stop rising. When an entire system relies on that belief, the smallest change in policy becomes a fault line. And the ground was already beginning to shift. The shift came quietly, as it often does. In 1989, the Bank of Japan began to tighten monetary policy. Interest rates were raised, cautiously at first, then more decisively. The intent was modest: cool speculation, reassert control, signal discipline. But in a system built on cheap money and ever-rising asset prices, even modest tightening is not neutral. It is a shock. Credit slowed, property transactions stalled, stock prices wavered, then fell. By early 1990, the Nikkei collapsed, losing nearly half its value in a matter of months. The illusion broke faster than it had formed. What followed was not a dramatic crash, but a long unraveling. Land prices began to decline, slowly at first, then persistently. Collateral that banks had relied on evaporated on paper, but the debt tied to it did not. Balance sheets hollowed out. Loans that had once looked conservative turned toxic. Yet instead of clearing the system, banks delayed recognition. Losses were hidden, restructured, rolled forward. Insolvency was treated as a temporary condition. This was the logic of survival, not deception. Acknowledging the scale of the problem would have meant admitting that the prosperity of the previous decade had been built on air. The real economy felt the effects in stages. Investment slowed, wages stagnated, confidence drained away. Companies stopped expanding and started conserving. The promise of lifetime employment weakened, then quietly broke. What made the crisis so damaging was not the fall itself, but the inability to reset. In other countries, bubbles burst and systems rebuild. In Japan, the fall locked institutions into paralysis. Fear replaced optimism, but debt prevented movement. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that this was no ordinary downturn. Growth failed to return. Prices began to fall, not rise. Deflation set in, rewarding delay and punishing risk. The economy entered a state where doing nothing felt safer than doing anything. The moment the Bank of Japan tightened policy, it revealed what had been hidden for years. The system had no floor strong enough to catch itself, and once exposed, there was no clean way back to the world before the fall. What followed was not collapse, but entrapment. Japan did not implode. It slowed, then froze. The system entered what economists call a balance sheet recession, a term that sounds technical, but describes a simple behavior. When assets lose value and debts remain, survival becomes the priority. Companies stop investing and focus on paying down loans. Households save instead of spend. Banks avoid risk instead of funding growth. Even when interest rates fall to near zero, no one wants to borrow. Money exists, but it does not move. This was the lock. Policy tools that worked elsewhere failed here because the problem was no longer liquidity. It was confidence and arithmetic. Lower rates could not make bad balance sheets good. Government stimulus filled some gaps, but it also pushed public debt higher, limiting future options. Every attempt to restart growth ran into the same wall. Demand was weak because expectations were weak. And expectations were weak because the past had taught caution. The economy was not broken in pieces. It was trapped in place. Demographics tightened the knot. Japan aged faster than any major economy in history. A shrinking workforce meant fewer consumers and fewer taxpayers. Deflation made holding cash rational, reinforcing stagnation. Zombie firms survived on cheap credit, preventing creative destruction and tying up capital that could have flowed to more productive uses. The very mechanisms designed to preserve stability ended up suppressing renewal. And this is where the Plaza Accord's legacy becomes clear. The agreement itself did not cause deflation, aging, or risk aversion. But it pushed Japan onto a path where adjustment was deferred, then avoided, then feared. Each policy choice made sense in isolation. Together, they created a system that could not reset without unacceptable pain. The trap was not imposed from the outside anymore. It was internalized. By the time Japan recognized the nature of the lock, escape required something politically and socially costly. Mass failures, deep restructuring, open acknowledgement of loss. That price was judged too high. So the system endured instead, stable, wealthy, technologically advanced, and unable to regain its former momentum. The question was no longer how Japan would recover, but whether recovery, as once understood, was even possible. Stop. The final irony is that the lever did not stop moving when Japan did. The Plaza Accord solved an American problem in the short term, but it reshaped the global system in ways no one fully controlled. The U.S. trade deficit narrowed briefly, then returned in the new forms. Manufacturing didn't revive, as hoped. It migrated. First to Japan's neighbors, then to China, where a different scale of surplus would later dwarf the one Washington had feared in the 1980s. The pressure that had been released did not disappear. It was displaced. Japan, meanwhile, became something new, a warning without collapse, a country that proved an advanced economy could stagnate indefinitely without social breakdown, without political extremism, without chaos. Safe, orderly, and constrained. The very stability that made Japan resilient also made escape harder. In choosing to avoid pain, it chose permanence. The cage held not because it was locked from the outside, but because opening it meant accepting losses that no leader wanted to own. And the United States was not untouched by the mechanism it had used. Financial power replaced industrial power as the primary tool of adjustment. Currency, capital flows, and asset prices became instruments of policy. This worked until it didn't. The logic pioneered in the 1980s would echo decades later in new crises, in new places, under new names. Each time, the promise was the same. Manage the system without confrontation. Each time, the cost appeared later. So did the U.S. Kill the Japanese economy in one day? No. That framing is too simple, too cinematic. What happened was subtler and more dangerous. A problem was shifted, not solved. A lever was pulled, and a system adapted around it in ways that could not be easily undone. Japan was not destroyed. It was locked into a different future. And that is the real lesson. In a world governed less by borders than by mechanisms, the most powerful moves are often the quietest. The question for the present is not whether such levers still exist. It is who is standing in their path now, confident, cooperative, and unaware of how difficult it will be to step aside once the system begins to move. Stop